You know, there was a time when cameras were just tools, and the real thing that people needed to improve was the skill how you use that thing. But recently, everything has changed. It's all about the latest specs, the latest camera, picking the right brand, stuff like that. I wanted to talk about that because this camera right here is the Panasonic GH5. I'm gonna get crucified for saying this, but this is one of the best cameras that ever existed, and is still one of the best cameras that ever existed. Let's talk about it.
I just wanna be great, I just wanna be great, I just wanna be great. Ain't no motherfucker in this world could do it like me. Open up your eyes and insert a little rising. You don't have
Hi, my name is Tom, and if you're new to this channel is all about cameras. So if you're interested in those sort of things, consider subscribing, consider hitting that notification bell, and if you want to help out a small YouTuber like myself, consider hitting that like button, because that would not only make my day, it would make my entire week. Let's talk about it. This is the Panasonic GH5, and I've been using this camera for years. This is arguably the best camera that I've ever owned. When it comes to my favorite cameras, it's somewhere between this one and the GoPro Hero cameras. I don't really know because they're good for different things. But overall, the experience of having a Panasonic GH5 is just so good on so many levels. Now, this of course definitely depends on what you use a camera, right? Like, if we're gonna talk about photography, then no, you probably don't need to look at this camera if that's your main goal. Don't make the mistake of thinking that I'm saying that this doesn't take good pictures. I'm just saying that for the price you would pay for something like this, there are better cameras that are better at still photography. If we're talking about video, however, then this is a very good camera. It only really has one quirk, and this is what I want to talk about when we're talking about how we've sort of turned skill into technology. Most cameras today do a really good job when it comes to autofocusing. For example, the Sony A7C that I'm shooting with now, the autofocus is just magical. I don't have to do anything. I always know, looking at the little flippy screen, that my eyes are in focus, and so I never have to worry about being out of focus. Now, there is autofocus on the GH5. Yes, there is. But it's terrible, and thus we don't use it at all. We use manual focus. And this is what I mean when we're talking about skills. Like, it's a real skill to know how to use manual focus, right? There is this little ring here, maybe you haven't noticed, but on all lenses, there is a manual focus. And if you're very skilled and if you learn how to do it, you don't really need autofocus. Now, I mentioned this before as a hack when I was vlogging, you know, doing like a video like this one. I would just connect my GH5 to my smartphone and I would just tap on my face on the viewfinder to focus in on my face, and all problems were solved. Didn't have to worry about it at all, because most of the time when you're vlogging like this, your face really isn't moving that much, at least not forward and backwards, and so you don't really need that much autofocus to begin with. You know, it's only when you're filming stuff. And sometimes autofocus is highly unreliable. Even on the Sony A7C, I was shooting this wedding a couple of weeks ago and it went great, but sometimes that autofocus, it was just jumping all around the place, even though the Sony A7C is really good at autofocus. And the reason is because it doesn't really know how to interpret the data. It doesn't know what I want to focus on. So if it sees a bunch of faces in the image, it still doesn't know what I want, you know. Sometimes it's just easier to tap to focus. Now, one of my favorite things about the GH5 is the fact that it can shoot in 4K 60 frames per second. Now today, it seems like pretty much every other camera can do that, except for my Sony A7C. Stupid camera. And Sony probably understands that most people don't need it, especially when you're vlogging like this. You don't need 4K 60 frames per second. But for someone like me, I shoot a lot of products, and sometimes I like to make these slow motion shots, and it doesn't need to be 120 or 240 frames per second. 60 frames per second is just enough to slow it down to get really nice cinematic B-roll. That in combination with the amazing image stabilization on the GH5 is why I really love to shoot on the Panasonic GH5. Still today, this camera was released in 2017 and I still keep on using it. What does that tell you? Okay, some of you will probably say that you're insane, Tom. You're like completely nuts. But no, I like a good camera. And when I see a good camera, when I like using a good camera, I keep on using it, you know, until I see a camera that does things a lot better. Now everybody's talking about the GH6, which is about to be released and it's gonna be awesome. And I look forward to testing out that camera, but I just don't really feel I need it. You know what I mean? Like, this is still a good camera. It's very affordable, especially today. You can get it for something like $700 or even less, you know. So I think that this is a very good camera. And there are so many things about this thing that I could probably talk about 30 minutes about this camera, maybe 40 minutes, and I'm not gonna do that. But one of the things that I really like about it is that it's built like a tank. Like, the construction of this thing is just built to last, okay? It's weather sealed, and it feels like if you would drop this thing, it would still be fine. You know, I still haven't dropped it yet, but it just feels like it would survive a hit like that. The flip out screen, also not very original in 2022, I know, but back in the day, this was, you know, pretty interesting. Like, Canon did have the T3i and it came out with that first, but in 2017, all cameras didn't have that. Now it feels like pretty much every camera has it. Even the Sony ZV-1, a compact camera. I mean, come on. You know, even the GoPro Hero 10 has a screen on the front because companies understand that we want to see ourselves, not to see how good we look, well, mostly that, but also to see if we're in frame or if we're in focus and stuff like that. Now, one of my favorite features about this GH5 is the fact that the image stabilization is really, really good, especially if you use a lens that also has image stabilization. You get something called like dual stabilization and you get really smooth shots. And it's not GoPro material, but for a camera this size, magical, fantastic. All the Sony cameras combined, that would make no sense. But basically Sony cameras, like, they're getting better, but the image stabilization on those things is still not as good on the GH5. And I've heard some Sony fanboys say that
You're wrong, Tom. You're completely wrong. There's nothing special about the GH5 stabilization.
and I say there is. There is even a setting for the stabilization, how you want it to actually act in the type of situation that you're in. If you want to be like in tripod mode, or if you want to be in a moving mode, like, there is a lot of settings. And that's one of the things that I really like about this camera, is that in the settings, you'll find so many things that you can tweak. You know, you can watch zebras and all sorts of things with this thing. It has a 4K time-lapse mode. Sony, are you listening? Ever heard of that? 4K time-lapse mode will be really awesome. Just saying. Put it in a firmware update. And that's also something that I really liked about the GH5. They kept on releasing these firmware updates that made the camera feel like a completely new camera. I remember there was this one feature where they put in that you could like record in something like 5K or 6K even. It was crazy. They like put in a higher resolution than it was actually advertised. You know, they really improved the firmware so much that it would utilize the camera in full. And so the final firmware update, it really nailed it, almost. The autofocus is still pulsing, but other than that, like, they put in so many features into this camera, you know, higher bit rates and stuff like that, and it's just a wonderful camera to use. But I'll be honest, people are spoiled today when it comes to autofocus, and because of the whole autofocus thing, most people will not even glance at this camera, because this is like a big no-no in the camera world when it comes to autofocus. Most people will just simply not even try it and miss out on how wonderful it is to use, which is kind of sad, but it kind of makes me and other GH5 fanboys feel special, I suppose. Now, I also like the fact that it has dual slots, so you can record on 2 memory cards at the same time, or just have like a backup memory card inside here. So that's a huge plus. There are so many customization buttons on this entire camera. I don't even know how many there are, but there's more than 10 customization buttons, okay? It's all over this camera. There's our custom buttons that you can program to do what you want. There is even like a crop-in mode. Like, this is what I'm talking about when it comes to features on a camera. They put in stuff like you can put it on a tripod and you can select frame A, frame B, where it crops in and goes from the left to the right in the video clip. Just imagine. Imagine making a time-lapse mode and having it crop in the image. Now, speaking of image, when it comes to image quality, taking photos or even videos, like when it comes to 4K videos, image is extremely sharp, probably even sharper than the Sony a7C, even though it's a full frame and even though it downsamples from 6K and stuff like that. I still think that the image is crispier on the GH5, but I'll make a separate video on this, actually comparing the GH5 to the Sony a7C to see which camera actually produces sharper image. But that's a whole topic on its own. Why do we want sharper image? Is that really important? Sometimes we want it to look a little flat, you know? Now, when it comes to colors and photos, I would say that the camera is good, but it doesn't really pop, okay? It's one of the downsides. You can tweak the image in post-production, but like on a Sony camera, it just pops automatically when you're recording. This camera doesn't do pop. It's more of a flat color profile type of camera. You can't tweak the image. You really have to know what you're doing if you're gonna tweak the colors on this thing. Like, it's not difficult or anything like that, but the skill to understand skin tones and the way colors, red, blue, and green work, you really need to know what you're doing. That's what I'm saying. And so I'd say that the Panasonic GH5 is a camera for skilled content creators, people who are creative, people who have time to sort of geek down into the details, into the menu system, and look at how things work and how they can utilize it in different ways. Yeah, this is a camera for camera geeks. Enough said. Okay, that's all I have for today. If you enjoyed this video, again, consider subscribing, consider hitting that notification bell, and if you feel like helping out a small YouTuber, a like would be highly appreciated. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.
I work hard each and every day. I get lost in the words I say. I don't push pause, no, I push play. I won't stop till I make a change. I withdraw on the things I make. I turn flaws into flawless traits. I build tall, never capped in space.